Hello, scientists. We're back for lesson 8 of Earth Science, and this one is called Wind Changes the Land. So we spent a couple days talking about the 3 different processes that shape the Earth. We talked about weathering, erosion, and deposition. And several times we mentioned the different ways that those things happen. One of the ways we mentioned was wind, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Over the next few days after today, we'll talk about all the other different things that can cause the land to change. So in the first paragraph on this page, it says, wind can shape land through weathering, erosion, and deposition. Wind picks up and moves small pieces of sediment such as soil and sand. When sand slams into rocks, tiny particles break off. The moving sand acts like sandpaper, rubbing the rocks smooth. So basically, how wind changes the land is weathering and erosion in this case go very much hand in hand. When a rock is weathered by the wind and there are pieces of sediment on the ground, the wind will pick up that sediment and kind of slam it around against rocks. And if you've ever been on the beach during like a windstorm, you know the sand from the beach can come up and like kind of pelt you a little bit, and it hurts. So imagine over millions of years that's been taking place, where little bits of sediment like sand or other smaller pieces of rock have been slamming into these rocks, okay? And every single time that happens, the more and more it happens, the more and more pieces break off, okay? So as the sediment is slammed into the rocks, that's the weathering. Because when the wind itself is not actually weathering the rock. It's the stuff that the wind picks up and slams into the rock that causes the weathering, okay? So that's what causes the piece of the rock to break off. The erosion happens when the wind picks up the sediment off the ground and kind of moves it around, okay? Which sometimes ends up slamming into other rocks, okay? So those are important, and the fact that as it moves along and slams into the rocks, it can also help rub it smooth. So as it's like the sediment is kind of pelting into the rock, it's actually rubbing it smooth. And if any of you have ever had a chance to experience sandpaper, sandpaper is very rough, okay? It's not really paper. You can get it in all different forms, but you can get it in sort of like a paper form or sometimes in like a brick form. And it's very rough. If you were to rub it against your skin, you would feel that it's very rough. And what people do with that is they would rub it against things like wood to smooth it out. Well, in real life out here in the places like the desert, actual pieces of sediment can act just like sandpaper, and the more they blow up against other rocks, the more they can kind of smooth it out as they're kind of flicking some of those pieces off of the rock. Okay? Now we're going to talk about sand dunes. Sand dunes form in windy places where sand is plentiful, such as on a beach or in a desert. Steady winds push grains of sand along the ground. Large objects such as rocks and plants block the sand's movement. A sand dune forms as more and more grains of sand are blocked by an object and become trapped. Over time, a sand dune may grow very tall. How tall? A few sand dunes reach heights of more than 500 meters, which is also 1,640 feet. So basically what happens is when the sand is picked up by the wind and kind of moved along, and this happens at beaches, if any of you have been to the beach, you've seen some sand dunes there, and the wind just keeps blowing the sand, kind of moving it along, and you can see in the picture here there are some ripples here that were caused by the wind blowing on the sand. The wind will kind of pick up and move the sand until something blocks it. And you know, if there's ever been a windy day, sometimes if you're trying to avoid the wind, you'll stand behind something. Maybe you'll stand behind a tree or even stand behind another person like mom or dad to try and block the wind from you. Or even put your jacket over your face or something to try and block the wind from hitting you. This is the same kind of thing that happens when sand dunes form. The wind will keep blowing the sand around until something is blocking it. Maybe it's a large plant or tree or a big rock or just whatever else is there. It could be more sand. Okay, but once the wind is blocked from moving the sand any further, the sand just stops. That's the deposition part. And then when it's deposited, it makes a sand dune. Okay, it's very possible that at one time this was all very flat, but then the sand came along, blew it around, and where it was deposited made it look uneven like this in these sand dune forms. Okay. So here's a very interesting photo. Actually, let's click on this one first. Make sure you always click on these. It says if conditions are right, grains of sand collect and form a sand dune. A sand dune is a landform caused when wind deposits sand. Okay, so wind causes sand dunes, and it's when the wind deposits sand. So we have a really great picture here. This is our first one since I've taken over that we have to actually click to look at. Pretty interesting when you think about it. I'm imagining how this happened right here. These landforms are called toadstool cap rocks. The rock at the bottom has resisted weathering more than the rock beneath. The softer lower rocks have worn away, leaving the unusual shapes. Okay, so what they're saying here is this part up here has not been weathered as much as this part down here. And there's a couple pieces of evidence of that. Number one, this part is bigger. These were probably more similar in shape, but as the weathering has affected this part of the rock, you can tell this one hasn't been weathered as much because it's larger. The part of it is larger. The other thing you can notice is how rough this looks. This looks very uneven and definitely kind of like a little rough. If you were to run your hand along this, you would definitely be able to feel some unevenness in the rock. However, down here, you can even see from the picture, this rock looks a lot smoother. And remember what we talked about when we read on the main page before we clicked on the picture, is that the more weathering happens, the more sand blows into it, the more it can smooth out the rocks like sandpaper. So that's another piece of evidence that this part right here has been weathered more than this because it's smoother. Okay, so the reason why this happens is the unusual shape. For whatever reason, the wind was blowing along, and maybe it's because the wind just doesn't take the sand that high up in the air, okay? But it blows along and it affected this, but really did not affect this. And now they're called toadstool cap rocks because they kind of look like mushrooms a little bit, okay? Like they have a bigger top and a smaller bottom area, okay? So a couple important things to remember. Wind causes weathering by picking up pieces of sediment and slamming it against other rocks. Wind causes erosion by actually picking up the pieces of sediment and moving it to another place. The toadstools formed by being weathered more at the bottom than at the top. Sand dunes form by having the wind carry the sand and deposit it when it gets blocked by something. When the wind can no longer take it any further because it's blocked, it deposits it and makes a sand dune. Okay? And the reason why we have ripples like this in the sand is because the wind is sort of blowing it along and moving it along. Okay? So, when we finish, feel free to enjoy some fill in the blanks to kind of highlight the important points of what we talked about today, and enjoy some time to climb. Good luck, and I'll see you again tomorrow.